I'm chair of the management department in the Robbins College of Business and Entrepreneurship at Fort Hays State University. I also hold appointments at Aarhus University in Denmark and at the University of Southern Denmark, along with the Shingo Institute, where I formerly served as its research director. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about concept selection. In a previous video we talked about concept generation, and the purpose there was to generate a lot of product or service concepts. The idea in this particular video is to get you to the point where that you can take those potentially many product or service concepts and winnow those down to a few, hopefully one, that you will then move forward with. So the concept selection process, and you may, if you've seen that video that I just referred to on concept generation, then you've seen this slide or a trivial variation thereof, which is to say that concept development is a much larger process. Rolling out a new product or a new service is a much larger process. In this particular video, we are only dealing with the information that resides in the white box on this one that says select a product concept, and equally it could refer to select a service concept. So we presume that you have already identified by whatever means necessary customer needs. The mission statement is only one possible way of identifying customer needs. There are probably better ones for that matter, and we talked about those in prior videos. We talked about, for example, ethnographic research and surveys and focus groups and customer complaint systems and a number of other ways that you might be able to do that. Social listening, where you scan social media to see what's being said on the internet. So there are a lot of ways that you might be able to obtain customer needs and identify customer needs. But we presume at this point that you've done that you've established target specifications or target performance objectives for that product or for that service. And that if there is an existing competitive product or service, that you've probably taken a look at that to see how it performs. After that, you generated product concepts, and we assume that you are now carrying those product concepts or service concepts that you generated into this step. This step is only select a product or service concept, and you can see that there will be subsequent things that you need to be able to do. So, in concept selection, there are a lot of things that we want to be able to do. So early on, we just wanted to identify those customer needs. Then we wanted to generate a lot of concepts. Now what we want to be able to do is select the one that we'll move forward with, or potentially a couple different ones that you might move forward with. But let's focus on identifying one. There are a lot of ways to do this, lots and lots of ways. So if you want to select from among those concepts, it might be an external decision. Maybe there is a customer. I have teams that I've directed in Denmark, for example, that what they do precisely is they develop a product or a service for some client, and they are at the mercy of that client in terms of what the final decision is. Now, they usually generate a lot of concepts, and they come up with some things, and they make prototypes, they do a lot of things. But ultimately, it is that customer or client who makes the decision as to which one they move forward with. That would be an external decision. Product champion, maybe an influential member of the product development team or the service development team itself, who chooses which one to move forward with, based on personal preference that we hope is professionally informed or experientially informed. Intuition, that gut feel, sometimes we do that. Pros and cons. So we list the pros, the things in favor of a concept, or we list the things that run against that concept. And then we try and, based on that pros and cons comparison for a number of different concepts, decide which one to move forward with. I don't know about you, I've used a lot of pros and cons lists every time I've wanted to do something. I always make it turn out the way I wanted it to turn out. In other words, at least for me, that pros and cons list approach is not a very reliable one, because I ultimately default to whatever it is that I wanted in the first place, whether that was the most rational choice or not. You might prototype and test. That can be very expensive. It's a good method, but it can be very expensive. Or you can use the approach that we will be learning in this particular presentation, which is to use decision matrices. And we will use those in two stages. We will use a matrix that is called a screening matrix. And ordinarily speaking, you use that to go from a large number of concepts to a much smaller, more manageable number of concepts, but probably you're not able to make a final decision. So we would then take that information from the screening matrix and move forward into what's called a scoring matrix. And we'll see how that works. That's what we'll be doing in this particular presentation. So concept screening, and sometimes that is enough. It's an approximate valuation. It's a very crude evaluation. That's how we want to distinguish between concept screening and concept scoring. Concept screening will be a very crude evaluation, but it might be enough in certain cases. Concept scoring will be a much more refined evaluation of concepts, and usually a smaller number of concepts than are involved in screening. So the scoring is very coarse, very crude. When we talk about screening, it becomes much more refined when we talk about concept scoring. So in terms of steps, these would be the normal things you would have to do. You prepare the selection matrix that ordinarily involves identifying what those concepts are that you want to be able to screen and the criteria by which you will use to screen those. The criteria need to be ones that apply to each of the concepts that are going to be screened. Each of the concepts. Each of the criteria must apply to each of the concepts. So that's a very important part. We would then rate the concepts. We'll do that in a very crude way, very coarse way. We would rank the concepts, which, because the rating itself is crude, the ranking itself is unrefined. We'll decide or think about combining and improving concepts, and then we would select one or more of those to move forward with. Finally, we'd reflect on the results in the process to make sure that we're doing things in a reasonable way. So what does the screening matrix look like? It looks more or less like this. The very first part of it says, what are the concepts that you want to be screening? Let's suppose, just for the sake of illustration, that we have 5, and we would denote those as A, B, C, D, E. We will designate one of those as the reference concept. Okay, now, the reference concept may be an existing product or service, but if you don't have that existing product or service, then what you would do is you would just designate one of those 5 concepts as your reference concept. It doesn't really matter which one. Okay, that will be up to you, up to the team that's doing this evaluation. But what we would then do is we would compare each of the other concepts, each of the remaining concepts, with that reference one. And we would do so on each of the criteria. So we need to identify the concepts and the criteria. So then what we would do, supposing that C is the reference as we've identified it here, is we would compare concept A to concept C. And for each of the criteria, we would ask the question and answer the question. On this criteria, is A similar to C, in which case we will assign a 0. Is it better than concept C, in which case we'll assign a plus sign and ultimately associate that with a positive 1. Or is it worse than concept C, in which case we would associate that with a negative 1 or a negative sign. So we will do that for each criteria comparing A to C. Then we move on to concept B, compare B to C. Move on to concept D, compare D to C. And finally compare E to C. In the reference column itself, it's like saying, how does C compare to itself? So we would be populating those cells with zeros. That is precisely what we've said here. Now, there are some things that we want to talk about here just to show you how crude or how coarse the evaluation process is. First, you know, I know, the entire world knows that it's unlikely that all of the criteria are equally important. In truth, one of the criteria is probably more important than the other 4, let's say. And that would typically be the case where the criteria, if you were very careful, would be differentially important, okay, or differentially weighted. But in something as crude as concept screening, we regard all of the criteria as equally important. We want the criteria themselves to be described at similar levels of detail. We want the concepts to be described at similar levels of detail. So we are trying to make as fair a comparison as possible, given that in fact we're using a course evaluation. So that is what we'll move forward with. In terms of how do we judge whether something is better, worse, or similar, we would like to have our criteria be as objective as possible. That is measurable if at all possible. Not necessarily in a highly refined way, but at least in a crude way. So once we go through that comparison, we might get something like this. And once we've done that, we're going to populate some rows that are beneath the darker gray area of this table. So we'll form some rows that are intended to identify for each of the concepts the number of pluses, the number of minuses, the number of zeros, and what those add up to. Let me go back to that slide for just a second. So if we go back to that for just a second, what we can see, well, we'll have trouble with that. We'll do that going forward. Okay, here we go. So now let's take a look at concept A, the column for that. And you see 0, 0, plus, minus, minus. What that indicates is that relative to the reference concept, that concept A scored similar to the reference concept on criteria 1 and 2. It scored as being better on criteria 3 and worse on criteria 4 and 5. Similarly for concept B, it was better on criteria 1, 4, and 5. It was similar on 2 and 3. You see the zeros as we described earlier for concept C because it's like comparing C to itself. For D, you see that D was better on criteria 1, 2, 4, was similar on criteria 3, and was worse on criteria 5. And then on E, we see that that E was superior to the reference concept C on all of the criteria except for criteria 2, where it was similar. Now, there are some things that we don't know. We don't know, for example, when we say that for any given concept that it's better than the reference with respect to some criteria, we don't know how much better. When we say it's worse, we don't know how much worse. We're treating the criteria as though they are equally important, which we know is not true in reality. Okay, therefore, we want to be not too refined as we go through this. So notice beneath in the darkest gray part of this table, you see the sum of pluses, sum of zeros, sum of minuses, and then the net score. The net score would add up to zeros, pluses, and minuses. You see the rank. So for concept A, you see rank number 5. You had 5 concepts, A, B, C, D, E. Rank number 5 indicates to you that that was the lowest rated of the 5 concepts. And then beneath, you see a question. It says continue, question. Here in the A column, you see a note in there. And what that would indicate is that we do not intend to move forward with concept A or any part thereof. So in general, what you're trying to do when you make these decisions, you're trying to say, should we continue? Yes or no? Should we combine something about that concept with one or more of the other concepts? Should we take one of the concepts and revise it somewhat, polish it a bit, let's say? Those are the sorts of things that you would be doing. So for example, if you could see, you probably see my picture of this video that's sitting down in the lower right-hand corner of this graph. But that said, down at the bottom of the E column, I can tell you that you would be saying, yes, we'll move forward with that. But in general, we're looking at one of these sorts of decisions when we say continue, or judgments. Yes, we will continue. No, we will not continue. We won't continue with this concept as is, but we'll combine some of its elements with something else, or we'll take this concept, we'll revise it, and we'll move forward with it. Okay. So remember, you're probably not going to get a single answer when you're doing concept screening. You're probably not going to have one that is just so much better than the others that you say, that's it. We have our answer. We'll move forward with that concept. So for example, even here, look at concept E and compare that to concept D. Well, there is one thing to be said for D. D didn't score as highly as E. Okay, D had 3 pluses and a minus. It only had a net of 2. Okay, only a net of 2. E had a net of 4. Should we do anything positive with D? The answer is probably so, and here's one of the reasons. Look at selection criteria 2. D was the only concept that had a positive on selection criteria 2. It was the only concept that scored superior to the reference on that second criteria. And by implication, since it was the only one that's positive, it's also the concept that scores most highly, period, on criteria number 2. So we usually don't get a cut and dried single answer out of this. What we hope to be able to do in concept screening is to reduce the number of concepts and then move forward with a few, which we would consider more deeply. So step number 4 in your concept selection process would be to combine and improve the concepts. So now you have rated, you have ranked those concepts, and the team should verify whether or not those are reasonable ratings that you've come up with, reasonable comparisons that you've come up with. And there are usually about 2 considerations that you're going to be looking at, the first of which is there a generally good concept that is degraded by one bad feature? That was true, by the way, for concept D. Concept D only had a 2 net score. I believe that placed it 3rd overall, but it was still the only one that scored positively on criteria 2. So in some sense, concept D was degraded on one of the other criteria, where it scored a negative. I don't recall which criteria that was. You could look back. But maybe D itself is a pretty good concept. It's just being diminished a bit by some feature that you might be able to do something about. And then 2 is, are there a couple concepts that you could combine to preserve some sort of better than, worse than relationships, yet getting rid of the worse than qualities when you get to the combined concept. So that's what we're looking for when we get down to these decisions. So step 5, select one or more of the concepts. That's where we're doing something like yes, no, revise, or combine. And then move forward with a reduced number of concepts from whatever it is you start. 6, make sure that you're using the process in a good way, that you're happy with the way that you've evaluated this and moved to this stage. But ordinarily speaking, what you're going to be doing at this point is moving a few concepts forward, a relatively few, that you will now consider much more deeply. That would get you to what is called concept scoring. So in concept scoring, there are going to be several changes. First, the criteria that you use. They may or may not be the same criteria. There may be more criteria, there may be less criteria, but whatever you've got, whatever you're going to be using for criteria will be more refined than the criteria that you were using in concept screening. They will be more intensely described, more extensively described. Okay? They should all be measurable in some way. They should be at approximately similar levels of detail in their descriptions. Similarly, when we look at the concepts that you move forward with, those concepts that you move forward with will now be described in more detailed ways. After all, you're going to be talking about moving forward with the production of a product or the rollout of a service that you have some substantial investment in, often anyway. And so you want to make sure that you do this right, that you're careful. So as we proceed through selecting a concept, we become more and more refined in our approach to doing so. And here we're doing that in 3 ways. Our concepts themselves will be described in a more refined way at similar levels of detail. Our criteria will be much more extensively described, and that will be done so in equal levels of detail for each of the criteria. But also we're going to use a different comparison mechanism. So now, instead of just better, worse, or similar, we're going to use a 5-point comparison. And that 5-point comparison will use, instead of numbers plus plus 1, minus 1, and 0, we'll use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 will correspond to much worse than the reference. 2 will correspond to, excuse me, worse than the reference. 0 will correspond to, or excuse me, 3 will correspond to similar to the reference. 4 to better, 5 to much better. So we're making 3 changes. The level of detail with which we describe our criteria, the level of detail with which we describe the concepts that we've moved to this stage, and our scoring system. And then a 4th one. We will weight the criteria. We will be more reality-based and say not all criteria are equally important. What are reasonable weights? Should this one get 20% of the overall consideration, this one 10%, this one 30%, and however many criteria you have, that adding up to 100%. So that's the sort of thing that we'd look at. So let's suppose that we are looking now at a product or a service, and we have a concept A, which we'll call the reference concept. You see DF. DF would indicate to you that you have combined 2 concepts. What were previously concept B, concept F. You don't see a B, you don't see a C. I guess that would indicate to you that those were eliminated from consideration. E, you see E. E has probably been carried forward in its present form. That's why it doesn't say something like revised or refined. And then you see, let's see, no, well, you do see F. F was combined with D. You see a G plus. And whenever you see that plus sign sitting there, what that means is that you've enhanced, you've revised that concept. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at, 4 concepts, let's say. A, which we're going to designate as the reference, a combined concept D and F, a combination of old D, old F, E, moving forward as it was, and then an enhanced version, if you will, or a revised version called G plus of concept G. Let's suppose that we're using 7 criteria. Notice that you see the weights. So criteria 1, 5% of the total weight, criteria 2, 15%, and so on. Those should add up to 100. Where do you get those weights from? You might get those from a lot of places, preferably directly from the customers. So not from a single customer usually, unless they are the decision maker ultimately, but at least from some sort of a combination of opinions that you derive from multiple customers. You might use an approach, a group decision-making approach, something like, let's say, the nominal group technique, which has been covered in another video. It is a group consensus group decision-making tool. It's easy to use. And here we have spread the weights. Let's suppose we've used nominal group technique somehow to get the weights that you see for these 7 criteria. So we'll use the rating scale that we talked about. So we're going to be comparing those concepts, DF, E, and G plus, each of those to the reference concept, which we said was A, on each of the 7 criteria. So on each criteria, we will say, let's say for concept DF. For concept DF, is it much worse, worse, similar, better, or much better than criteria 1 for the reference concept? Same question. Much worse, worse, similar, better, or much better on criteria 2 than the reference. And we would do that for each of the criteria. We'd do that for each of the concepts. And that's what you see sitting here. Next, let's talk about just one of those. You see the A, the ratings, 3, all of them 3. That's because you're comparing A to itself. DF, let's look at DF, 3, 4, 3, 3, 5, 3, 3. What that indicates is that DF was similar to the reference on criteria 1, criteria 3, 4, 6, and 7. It was better on criteria 2. It was much better on criteria 5. Now, criteria 2, criteria 5, those were semi-important criteria. I say that because their weights were not low, their weights were not high. They were kind of in the middle, 15 each, whereas the two most important criteria were criteria 4 and criteria 6, and DF was only similar to A on those criteria. How about criteria E? Better concept E. Better on criteria 1? Who cares? Criteria 1 was only 5% of the weight. So even though it's better in a way that doesn't generate a lot of advantage for that concept on that criteria. Criteria 2, better. Criteria 3, which was again not a very important criteria, only 10% of the weight. Well, 5, much better. It was worse on criteria 4, and criteria 4 is the most important of the criteria. And then it was better on criteria 5, worse on criteria 6. Well, that was the second most important criteria. It had a weight of 20. And then the last criteria, it had a weight of 3. It was similar. So if I'm looking without going any further, I'd say D and A, they look pretty similar. E and A look pretty similar. DF looks a little better so far. How about G+, revised? It's better on criteria 1, who cares? It's much better on criteria 3, who cares? It's similar on criteria 4, 5, worse on 6, similar on 7. So how do these compare overall? Well, what we would do next is we would carry out a multiplication. You can look at this slide and revisit it if you want and obtain the formula, but I'll just step you through the calculations. So in the calculations, you can see, look in this cell where I have the cursor pointing. You see 0.15, 0.15. That would be taking this weight as a proportion, so 0.05, times 3 is 0.15. Okay. For this one, the 0.45, that is the weight in decimal form. 0.15 times the rating, 3, 0.45. These will add up to 3. For DF, that combined concept, we do similar things. So for example, this 0.60, we obtain that by taking the weight for the criteria, 0.15 in decimal form, times the rating, 4, equals 0.60. And we do that for each of these. And eventually we would get a sum of 3.45. For E, 3.10. For G+, 3.05. Do you have a clear winner? Well, I don't know that we have a clear winner yet. We're not going to go much further in the slide set, but we don't have a clear winner yet, I don't think. What we do have is we have one whose score seems to stand out from the others, 3.45 compared to 3 others that were all similar and close to 3. In particular, though, we see that there was at least a couple problems, that it was actually worse. That concept was worse on the most important criteria, it wasn't worse, I'm looking at DF. It wasn't worse, but are there some places where you might be able to pick up some points? Well, look, DF was only similar to the reference on criteria 3, whereas each of E and G+ were much better. Might we be able to do something, learn something from E or G+ that we could incorporate into DF? If so, we'd want to do that. So what I'm saying fundamentally is this. We may not have a clear winner at this point. What we may have at this point is a situation where we have DF looking better than the others, but it could probably still be improved further by borrowing an idea here that maps into criteria 3, let's say, from E or from G+, or maybe from both. So we can probably do better still. But at some point, if you keep moving forward with this and revising and combining and so on, you should get to a place where you have a clear winner. So that's what we were just talking about, is combining and improving concepts. That means that you can't just look at that score at the bottom and make a decision based on that, at least not usually. You really need to look at a comparison of these things and see if there's anything that you can learn, anything that you can borrow from one concept that would improve some of the other concepts. And then we're going to select one or more of the concepts. So what I'm saying is you may have to do this iteratively. You may have to go through this a few times. And that's what we're talking about when we get to the bottom of this. Now, I wasn't paying a whole lot of close attention to what I entered as no, 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 and develop down at the bottom. But it's the same sort of idea that you just saw in concept screening. You're going to have that deeper discussion. The overall rank, well, this first concept, concept A, the reference, is scored lowest. E and G plus scored next, second lowest, second lowest was G plus, and third lowest was E, but all of those were actually very similar. Whereas DF did stand apart from the others. So, even though I wrote develop in this table, the truth of it is, before I ever did that, I would be looking to see if I could learn anything from E and G plus that would help me improve DF relative to criteria 3. And I would be looking at some of the others of these to see if there was something here too. To look at DF on criteria 1, admittedly not a very important criteria, weight only 0.05. Nevertheless, both E and G plus scored better than did DF. Could I do something, learn something that would help me there? Those are the sorts of things I'm going to be looking for before I ever actually develop. Okay? I'm going to see if there's more to be learned so that I could improve this concept further. So again, this is an approach that you want to reflect on. You want to be sure that you've been complete, that you've been fair in your comparisons, that you were using the right criteria, that you were using good measures to determine whether or not something was much better, better, similar, worse, or much worse, and so on. And you went through these steps. You probably went through, in concept selection, you probably went through concept screening first. You probably didn't get enough information to arrive at a final choice, so you moved on to scoring. You polished your criteria in scoring. You scored in a more detailed way, 1 through 5, as opposed to just plus, minus, and 0. You elaborated your criteria more thoroughly. You elaborated your concepts more thoroughly. Beyond that, you also weighted the criteria, recognizing that not all criteria are equally important. And in doing that, we went then through these steps. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Prepare the selection matrix, rate the concepts, rank the concepts, combine and improve concepts, select one or more concepts to move forward with. Reflection. And you do that whether it's screening or whether it's scoring. You just have a little more or a little less to reflect on, depending on whether it's screening or scoring. And your rating and your ranking is more or less refined. More refined for scoring than for screening. So that is a quick and dirty overview of concept selection. Hopefully, before you looked at this video, you would have looked at one on concept generation, whether mine or someone else's. Thanks very much, and we'll see you for some other topic.